Hi everyone. So today we're going to just quickly talk through chapter 2 in the textbook. We have arguments based on emotion or appeals to pathos, which you may have heard of before. It's the easiest of the appeals to recognize, in my opinion. And you're writing a literacy narrative as your first essay, but you're making an argument as well. Somewhere in your literacy narrative, you are going to make sure that you are coming to a conclusion. You're drawing a conclusion based on your exploration and reflection of your literacy development, your reading, writing, and communication development throughout your life and where you plan to go with it in the future. So it's fitting that we study emotional appeals because that's what you're making. You will be using emotional language, narrative techniques, and situations to convince people of your point, whatever it is that you're coming to. So you have been given a couple of samples. So far this week, you're going to look at On Writing by Stephen King, and you're going to look at Superman and Me by Sherman Alexie. And both of those are literacy narratives, but they also make an overarching argument. So you can think of their stories of literacy development as appeals that they are building. So they're using personal anecdotes to build a claim. So whatever it is that they are arguing, you're going to determine when you read that. But as you read chapter 2, I want you to think about the benefits and drawbacks of using emotion. So in this chapter, you see lots of examples of how emotion can be used successfully, but how it can also be used to manipulate. The chapter is super easy to get through, so I really hope that you do read it, even though I'm not asking you to specifically write about it. You will be expected to take into account what you're seeing here when you are writing your literacy narrative. So some people use emotion, as you can imagine, as a fallacy or to manipulate or to misrepresent, to really get people emotionally involved for the wrong reasons. The textbook says rashly or casually. It's really important that you keep in mind your audience. So your peers will read your literacy narrative draft, and I will read your final draft. So just remember that we need to get your point, but you don't ever want to potentially hurt someone or manipulate them using your emotional appeals. This will come into play even more when we do our rhetorical analysis, which is next, by the way. You need to read about that when you're finished with your draft for next week. But also when you are writing your own original argument. So this is just kind of practice in using these appeals. It's not going to be a focus of the grading this time around, but all of this information, as I said, is building toward that large argument assignment that we will be doing. So the next part of the chapter, well, once it loads, it's thinking, is to read critically for pathos. And so when you do that, we are setting ourselves up for rhetorical analysis. So how is it that writers can effectively use emotion? It can be humor, it can be sadness, it can be all kinds of different emotions. So it could be anger, frustration. So don't think that it just has to make you cry. It could be any emotion. So a lot of people use really sad stories or, advertisements like those terrible ASPCA commercials that make you want to give all your money to the doggies. That works. It works really well. But in a way, it's manipulating you. So that's, you have to think about the ethics of it as well. There are several examples here for you to look at and evaluate, including some updated ones. You don't have to do these responses, but these are things for you to think through. And again, Using emotions to build bridges is something that we won't focus on for this particular essay, except for perhaps when you are making your conclusion at the end. So if you've given all of these emotional stories and descriptive stories about your literacy development, and then you provide your point in the conclusion, whatever it is that you're trying to say about the importance of literacy, about what you have determined is your takeaway from this reflection or what others should keep in mind, then this could be considered a bridge. So your stories will bridge into that point, and you capture your audience by using the stories, and then you move into the conclusion which they're more likely to believe. Now, this particular example is a shorter one. It's about someone losing a job, Steve Jobs to be exact, before he became what he was. And it's a pretty great story, but this is not about a literacy development, so just keep that in mind. It's not an example for your literacy narrative. There are lots more examples, and then the chapter goes through how these build a bridge. So sometimes when you get into writing an original argument, you can use emotions to build a bridge between you and a person that you may not agree with, or someone who has an opposite opinion as you. This can really be a good way to level the playing field a bit. And then finally, you use emotions to sustain an argument. Again, this is really going to come up mostly when we do our original argument, but there are some examples here about vivid detail. And so this type of detail is exactly the type of detail that I want you to use when you're writing this particular essay. So even though we're not worried about sustaining an argument necessarily right now, I do want you to think about this example on page 39 of the vivid detail and the language I expect you to use. I should feel like I'm in the story when I read your literacy narrative, because you're going to be talking about past, present, and future. So I really want to feel like I know you better and I'm a part of these stories when I'm reading them. So that's really all to take away from chapter 2. I just wanted to mention it because it may seem a little disconnected, but we do need to continue to read the content in the textbook and take the examples that we can until we need them when we build our rhetorical analysis and our original argument later on. So think of the writing in these, especially this one here on page 39, as an example of the type of language that you can use to be really descriptive. While this is in the third person and you'll be speaking in the first person for the most part, it's still a good model for the type of language. But otherwise, just keep in mind that emotional arguments can be very successful, but you have to be careful to be ethical and not attempt to manipulate people. That's it. Next up, you want to watch the literacy narrative, and just keep in mind that that was created for a class that meets face-to-face, so keep that in mind when you watch it.